Greetings, classmates.
Here we are.
I'm Alex Eric.
I'm Caleb Glass.
We're going to talk to you today about the ecological systems model. Start out with this quote: "To understand human behavior, we must assess not only the individual, but also the context in which that individual lives and the interactions of both." So ecological systems models kind of addresses human behavior from a context of a whole encompassing set of circumstances in which a person lives in. Alright, this is just a brief definition of how I define what the ecological systems model is about. It is an attempt to explain why students exhibit behavioral issues, including a, quote, variety of excessive, chronic, deviant behaviors ranging from impulsive and aggressive to depressive and withdrawal acts which violate the perceiver's expectations of appropriateness and which the perceiver wishes to see stopped. So, in that vein, why does a student exhibit deviant behavior? It has to do with a whole set of circumstances in which a human lives and moves in. As applied to human behavior, the ecological systems model implies that it is meaningless to discuss problems of behavior in isolation from the context in which these behaviors arise, since it is these very contexts that define the behavior as a problem. Therefore, behavior problems that is, must be addressed with a systems model which addresses all the factors in the child's ecosystem.
Alright, so this is a graphic that's pretty commonly known with our theory, and it's in the book. So I'm just going to go through a little bit and explain what the graphic means. So the core of the circle is the student. That's the individual. That's all of his physical characteristics, kind of what makes him up as a person. The next circle outside of it is his microsystem, and that's his physical environment, and that's kind of his parents and or his siblings, or the people that he is really. Oh, sorry, let me back up. Yeah, no, I'm right. Okay, so that's just the people he comes into contact with on a really daily basis. And then outside of that is the mesosystem, and then those are environments that, if I could find it, those are environments that he comes across on a fairly regular basis, but they're not as intimate as the microsystem. And then the exosystem are things that affect him, but are not directly related to him. And then the macrosystem is like laws of the country and the society he lives in, and cultural values. And so even though things in the macrosystem you wouldn't think affect you directly, all these parts do affect the individual as a whole. And then I have evaluation procedures. So a good ecological assessment should describe the environment of a student, list the demands of the student, including the expectations of others in his or her environment, and define the skills and behaviors needed by the student to be successful. And so as a part of that assessment, an FBA is usually necessary. That's a functional behavior assessment. That's described more in depth in Chapter 7. And then also a behavior and emotional rating scale, or a BERS, could also be applied, and that is just kind of a common test used for students who might be EBD for an assessment.
And it's also used across a multitude of different platforms, such as the family, the educational environment, and also the student rates his or herself, as well as the social worker usually does an assessment. That leads us into systems and their units, because, as this theory points out, people do not exist in and of themselves, but in a complex patchwork of human connection. So the systems and their units are the following: a family unit, the social or cultural unit, and the educational system unit.
I have family unit. And so in the family unit, the book states that parent involvement is really heavily important. They say that perhaps with no other exceptionality, does successful intervention depend so heavily on parent involvement. And there needs to be a common connection between home and school. The parents and the teacher need to be in contact and have a good understanding of what's expected at school so that it's also expected at home and vice versa. Because if something is regarded as inappropriate at school but is not inappropriate at home, then true intervention might not happen. And then it also states that parental involvement can enhance counseling efforts with students. It says many theorists view parental involvement in counseling sessions with children with emotional behavior problems as a necessity.
That brings us to our social unit, which is broken up into 4 distinct parts, which is the juvenile justice and correctional system. This is important for teachers of students with EBD to know about because many youth with EBD have histories of arrests and other incidences of law breaking. One report noted that 35% of youth with EBD have been arrested as compared to only 13% of students without disabilities. So it's important that the teacher with EBD knows a lot about the juvenile justice system and how it works, as well as the social welfare system. It's provided to eligible families, including health services, family planning, housing services, emergency aid, protective services for minors. Children may come to the attention of the social welfare system due to abuse or neglect, substance abuse in terms of the parents, unmet mental health needs, and domestic violence. So it's important that EBD teachers know how to be, teachers of students with EBD are familiar with how the social welfare system works, as well as the mental health system, how to get into contact with school psychologists and other psychologists and to communicate with other outside organizations, because that's going to come into play when you're working with those people, as well as the education system, which we are all well aware of because we work in it.
So to touch a little bit more on the educational system, so the education system may be the second most important system in the lives of students with EBD because of the potential for impacting their daily lives. That's second behind the parental involvement. And so the section describes that it can be difficult for moving students from one educational placement to another. The ultimate goal is to ensure that the student is in the least restrictive environment possible. So obviously, like, a juvenile center would be the most restrictive, and then mainstream classes would be the least restrictive. And then that can be difficult because research shows that students with EBD are the least accepted students in our schools and the most negatively viewed. So it can be hard to put them in their least restrictive environment because of that bias. And so some guidelines for like reintegration of students from like one system of restrictive environment to another is to go from rigid to flexible scheduling as the student accepts the intervention. Go from external to internal control, and what that says is external reinforcers may be necessary, like heavy supervision and planning are done for the student, and structure is lessened as the student displays appropriate behaviors. You go from short-term to long-term goals, and from segregation to integration.
And I think this is often what you see in like level 3 settings, is when you have that more flexibility, where students have a little bit more control over what their day looks like, which gives them a sense of control. It could be a really positive thing.
Yeah. And then just some suggestions for students with EBD in less restrictive settings. Maximize instructional time. Downtime is usually not a good idea. Have high rates of positive teacher to student interactions. Have positive reinforcement as much as possible, and clear, consistent scheduling and routines.
All right. So I'm just going to quickly summarize kind of what we went over. Ecological theorists believe that it is impossible to define disoriented behavior in isolation from the context in which the behavior occurs. Disordered behavior is viewed as a disbalance in the equilibrium of the system. Therefore, the child is viewed as part of the problem rather than the owner of the problem. So, in this theory, all parties have a responsibility to play. In theory, all components of the disturbed system should be analyzed for contributing factors and then targeted for intervention, along with the child. In practice, analyzing and intervening in disturbed systems is difficult, time-consuming, and difficult to evaluate. A systems approach to serving this population has been touted by many, including the National Mental Health and Special Education Commission. So, in summary, we just, as educators of students at the EBD, we need to be really careful to work together with all members and units that interact with the student in their life, and find solutions and reinforcements that interact in all of those different areas, because students do not exist in and of themselves only, but within a patchwork in a community.
Nice.
Boom. There's our